My name is Rachel Bennett, and I was 44 years old the night my own mother tried to kill me with a syringe full of water. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something that happens on a true crime channel to somebody else's family, in somebody else's kitchen, under somebody else's fluorescent light. It happened in mine. It happened on a Tuesday, which felt insulting somehow, like tragedy should at least have the decency to wait for a weekend. I was on the floor of my own kitchen when it happened, my back against the cabinet under the sink, my hands not answering me anymore. My blood sugar was crashing so fast I could feel my own heartbeat in my teeth. And above me, kneeling just close enough to look like she was helping, was my mother, Carol Bennett, 66 years old, telling the 911 dispatcher in the calmest voice you have ever heard that her daughter was a diabetic and she thought I'd taken too much insulin. Too much insulin. Not too little. Too much. She said it twice, so it would stick. I remember the paramedics' hands more than their faces. I remember the plastic mask they pressed over my mouth, cold at the edges, and the particular way one of them said my name. Rachel, stay with us, Rachel. Like a rope thrown down a well. I remember the specific, ridiculous detail of my kitchen radio still playing softly from the counter, some late-night talk show host laughing about traffic, while a paramedic pushed glucose into my IV line, and my mother stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching, composed, already rehearsing the story she'd tell everyone afterward about how hard this was for her. I remember the exact weight of the oxygen mask against my cheekbones, and the strange floating detail that my own front door was still standing open behind the paramedics, letting cold night air roll across the kitchen tile, while my mother explained calmly that she'd simply stopped by to check on me and found me like this. Found me like this. As if she were a witness. As if she hadn't been standing in that exact kitchen 20 minutes earlier. Somewhere behind all of it, a phone kept recording. What she didn't know. What none of them knew. Not the dispatcher. Not the paramedics who came through my front door 4 minutes later. Not even me, lying there watching the ceiling tilt. Was that my 17-year-old son Tyler had left his phone propped against the fruit bowl 20 minutes earlier, recording himself for a school video project on family traditions. The phone was still rolling. It had been rolling the entire time. And somewhere in that footage, behind Tyler practicing his lines about his grandmother's apple pie recipe, my mother had walked to the refrigerator, opened my insulin case, and done something with her hands that the camera saw perfectly, even though nobody in that kitchen did. Hey, before I go any further, welcome to Betrayal House. If you're new here, this is the place for stories about the people who underestimate us the most. The family members who think quiet means weak and calm means stupid. If that sounds familiar, hit subscribe, because you are exactly who this channel is for. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because I want to know how many of you are hearing this late at night, the way I would have wanted to hear it. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because the kitchen floor isn't the beginning. It's barely even the middle. I need to go back almost 40 years, to a small rented house outside Sacramento, California, where I was the older of 2 kids and somehow already the invisible one. It was a house with thin walls and a linoleum kitchen floor that always felt cold under bare feet, no matter the season, and a front yard my father mowed every Saturday morning whether it needed it or not, because mowing the lawn was the one thing in that house he could control completely. Everything else, it turned out, belonged to my mother's careful, invisible arithmetic of who deserved what. My brother Danny was born 3 years after me, and from the moment he arrived, our house rearranged itself around him the way furniture gets rearranged for a new baby. Except the rearranging never stopped. My mother wasn't cruel to me, not in any way you could point to and photograph. She just had a way of looking past me to see if Danny needed something first. If we both cried, he got picked up. If we both did well in school, his report card went on the refrigerator, and mine went in a drawer. So it doesn't get ruined, she said, though I noticed his never seemed to be in danger of ruining either. You're the strong one, Rachel, she used to tell me, usually right after doing something that required me to be strong about it. I was 7 the first time I understood what that sentence actually meant. It meant, I am not going to take care of this feeling for you. It meant, figure it out alone, and don't make it my problem. I still remember the smell of that house. Cigarette smoke my mother swore she'd quit, and the sweet, waxy smell of the birthday candles she bought every year. Always vanilla-scented. Always the same brand. On my 8th birthday, she bought a cake from the good bakery downtown, iced with my name in careful cursive letters. I watched her carry it to the table, so proud of it I could see it in her posture, and then watched her set it down in front of Danny's chair instead of mine, because he's had a rough week at school, Rachel, you understand? I understand now. I didn't understand then. The cake had my name on it. He blew out the candles anyway. Make a wish, sweetheart, my mother told him, her hand on his shoulder, while I sat 2 feet away holding a fork that suddenly felt like it belonged to nobody. There's a phrase for the specific ache of watching your own name used to celebrate somebody else. I didn't have that phrase at 8. I just had the ache, and I kept it, quietly, the way I kept most things in that house. Not loud, just permanent. There was a small ceramic bowl on our kitchen counter growing up, chipped blue, older than either of us kids, that my mother used for exactly one purpose, mixing the sugar and cinnamon for Danny's toast every morning. A little ritual just for him. I asked once when I was 9 if she'd make mine that way too. That bowl's just for Danny's mornings, she said, without looking up. Get your own bowl, Rachel. I did. I got my own bowl. I got my own everything for the next 36 years. And I want you to remember that chipped blue bowl, because it comes back later, in a kitchen I owned myself, in a way my 9-year-old self never could have predicted. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside, because the house is full of people, and the refrigerator has food in it, and nobody is yelling. It just lives in the small transactions. It lives in the fact that when I had a nightmare, I learned to go back to sleep by myself, because the one time I walked down the hall to my parents' room, my mother told me, not unkindly, just factually, that Danny needed her more because he had a big game the next day. I was 8. He was 5. There was no game. By 10, I'd stopped walking down that hall entirely. I taught myself to count backward from 100 until my heart slowed down. Alone, in the dark, in a room down the hall from 2 parents who loved me in a distant, dutiful way that never once felt like safety. Nobody had to tell me twice. I don't tell you about the bowl to make you sad for a 9-year-old. I tell you because that bowl is still in my kitchen today, right side up, exactly where I decided it belongs. I don't say any of this because I want your pity. I say it because it matters later, because everything that happened to me at 44 had already been rehearsed in that house 36 years earlier. My mother wasn't improvising the night she knelt over me in my kitchen. She had been practicing her whole life how to look like the caring one while making sure the resources, the attention, the love, all flowed one direction, toward Danny, away from me. By the time I was 10, I had stopped expecting comfort and started building competence instead. If nobody was going to hold my hand through a hard thing, I decided I would simply become the kind of person hard things didn't scare. I didn't know yet how useful that decision would turn out to be. The moment that changed everything came when I was 12 years old, on a Saturday morning in March, when I fainted in the bathroom, and my mother found me on the tile with my lips faintly blue. The diagnosis came 2 days later, delivered by a pediatric endocrinologist, a doctor who specializes in hormones and blood sugar regulation, in a small office that smelled like hand sanitizer and old carpet. Type 1 diabetes, he explained, gently, is an autoimmune condition where your own immune system destroys the cells in your pancreas that make insulin, the hormone your body needs to turn food into usable energy. Without insulin injections, your blood sugar rises to dangerous levels. With too much insulin, or not enough sugar to balance it, your blood sugar can crash low enough to cause seizures, coma, even death. I was 12 years old, and I understood in that office that my body was now a machine I had to operate manually for the rest of my life, with no owner's manual, no days off, and, I realized within the first month, no help. My mother came to exactly one of my early appointments. After that, my father drove me when he wasn't working, and when he wasn't working, I drove myself, once I was old enough, to blood draws and follow-ups in a car with a glove box full of glucose tablets. I still remember the night I had my first low blood sugar emergency at home, shaking so hard I could barely hold a juice box, and calling down the hall for my mother. She came, eventually, mostly annoyed at having been interrupted. "You have to learn to handle this yourself, Rachel," she said, standing in my doorway in her robe. "I can't be your nurse forever." She never once offered to be my nurse for a night. Not one night in 32 years. Here's what I didn't know back then, sitting on that bathroom floor with juice dripping down my wrist. That sentence was about to become the accidental foundation of my entire life. Because if nobody was going to manage this disease for me, I was going to have to become the most disciplined, most detail-obsessed, most meticulous record keeper my endocrinologist had ever seen. Not because I wanted to. Because I had no other option. I started keeping logs. Actual paper logs, in a spiral notebook, of every blood sugar reading, every unit of insulin, every meal, every symptom, time-stamped by hand, because in the 1990s, nobody handed a 12-year-old a glucose monitoring app. By the time I was 14, I could tell you, from memory, what dosage adjustment I needed based on a school lunch menu. By 16, my endocrinologist used my logbook as an example for other newly diagnosed teenagers, because he said he had never seen documentation that clean from an adult, let alone a kid. Nobody in my family called that a skill. My mother called it Rachel being intense about her little charts. I remember showing her my spiral notebook once, proud of a whole month with no dangerous lows, hoping, the way kids always hope, that this might finally be the thing that impressed her. She flipped through 2 pages, handed it back, and said, "That's nice, honey. Danny made varsity, did you hear?" I hadn't asked about Danny. I closed the notebook and went back to my room and kept logging anyway, because by then I understood something most 14-year-olds never have to learn, that doing something well for your own sake, with no audience at all, is its own kind of survival. But it was a skill. It was, in fact, the exact skill that would end up saving my life at 44, though I couldn't have known that yet, sitting at my desk at 16, carefully logging a Tuesday. I carried that discipline straight into adulthood. I studied accounting in college, not because I dreamed of spreadsheets as a little girl, but because I had already spent a decade proving to myself that patience, documentation, and precision were the only tools that had ever kept me safe. Numbers didn't play favorites. A ledger didn't love your brother more than you. If the debits and credits balanced, they balanced, regardless of who you were in the family. I became a CPA at 26, a certified public accountant, which just means I passed a rigorous set of state exams qualifying me to handle official tax filings, audits, and estate accounting for other people's money, the kind of work where a single misplaced decimal can cost someone their house. I built a small but steady practice in Sacramento doing tax and estate work for local families, the kind of quiet, unglamorous job where nobody claps for you but everybody needs you eventually. One of my first clients, an elderly widower named Mr. Halloran, told me once that he trusted me with his late wife's estate because I was the only accountant who'd ever shown him, line by line, exactly where every dollar went. "Most people just want you to trust them," he said. "You showed me the numbers instead. That's better than trust." I thought about that sentence more than he probably meant for me to. I got married at 29, had my son Tyler at 31, and got divorced at 36, amicably enough that his father, Mark, still came to Tyler's games, and we still texted about parent-teacher conferences without static. A normal Tuesday back then looked like this. Up at 6, blood sugar check before coffee, insulin dose calculated to the gram of carbohydrate in my breakfast. Tyler's lunch packed while he complained about literally any topic available to a 17-year-old. A full day of client meetings where I explained tax code in plain English to people twice my age, and an evening where I checked my glucose monitor as automatically as other people check the time. It was not an exciting life. It was, after 32 years of practice, a life I had built to be almost entirely without emergencies. By 44, I owned a modest house with a paid-down mortgage, a diabetes management routine so tight my doctor called me the most boring patient I have, in the best possible way, and a 17-year-old son who was, somehow turning out kind despite everything. I was, by any reasonable measure, the success story of that house on the outside of Sacramento, which is exactly when things started to feel wrong. It started small enough that I almost talked myself out of noticing it. About 8 months before that night on my kitchen floor, my father, Robert Bennett, died of a heart attack in his sleep at 71. His death broke something open in our family that had been sealed for decades. Not just grief, but money, and the uncomfortable truth about who my father had actually trusted. At the reading of his will, our estate attorney, a calm, precise woman named Diane Ortiz, explained that my father had set up a family trust 2 years before his death. A trust is simply a legal arrangement where assets, in this case the house, his investment accounts, and a rental property, are held and managed by someone called a trustee for the benefit of the family, rather than being handed out directly. And my father had named me, Rachel Bennett, as sole trustee. Not my mother, not Danny. Me. The trust document included a clause. A successor trustee clause, Diane explained, which is a built-in backup plan stating who takes over management of the trust if the original trustee dies, resigns, or is declared legally incapacitated, meaning medically or mentally unable to make sound decisions. In my father's trust, if I were ever declared incapacitated, control would pass, temporarily, to my mother, Carol Bennett, until I recovered or a court decided otherwise. I remember sitting in that lawyer's office and watching my mother's face when she heard that clause read aloud. It wasn't grief on her face. It was calculation. Your father always did like his little contingency plans, she said, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. I didn't think much of it that day. I was too busy grieving my father, a quiet, gentle man who apparently understood exactly what kind of daughter deserved his trust, and exactly what kind of wife might need to be locked out of easy access to money. That should have been the whole story right there, shouldn't it? A father's love, quietly documented, arriving decades late, but arriving all the same. It wasn't the whole story. It was only the opening line of the real one. Because about 6 weeks after the will was read, my blood sugar started doing something it had never done in 32 years of near-perfect control. It started crashing, randomly, violently, in ways my own meticulous logs couldn't explain. The first time, I was making dinner, and my hands started shaking so hard I dropped a knife. My glucose monitor read 41, a number low enough to cause seizures if it drops much further, since a normal fasting reading sits around 80 to 100. I drank juice, waited, checked again, and slowly came back to myself, chalking it up to a bad injection site or an unusually active day. The second time was worse. I woke up on my bathroom floor at 2 a.m. with no memory of getting there, my monitor reading 38, my shirt soaked through with cold sweat. Tyler found me that time. He was 17, and he still tells me he'll never forget the sound of the shower running with nobody standing under it, because I'd apparently tried to get up and clean myself off before I went down. "Mom, you scared me," he said, sitting on the bathroom tile with me afterward, holding a glucose tablet up to my mouth like I was the child now. "You don't ever look scared. You looked scared." I didn't have an answer for him that night. I just remember thinking, somewhere underneath the fog, that I had spent 32 years being so good at this disease that my own son had never once seen it get the better of me. Now it was getting the better of me every few days. "Mom, has this happened to you before? This many crashes in 1 month?" I asked my mother on the phone the next morning, still shaky, still scared in a way I hadn't been since I was 12. "You're 44 now, Rachel," she said. "Bodies change. Maybe you're just getting older. Have you thought about that? Getting older doesn't rewrite 32 years of stable insulin math in 6 weeks. I didn't say that out loud yet. I just felt for the first time in decades that same old thing from childhood. The feeling of being told, gently, calmly, that whatever was happening to me was my problem to solve alone, and not quite real enough to be anyone else's concern. I didn't know yet that my mother had started visiting my house twice a week, to help since your father passed, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her for emergencies, always somehow ending up alone in my kitchen for a few minutes while I showered or took a work call in another room. I didn't know yet that the numbers on my glucose logs, my own numbers, kept with the same obsessive precision I'd developed at 12 years old, were about to become the most important evidence I would ever collect in my life. All I knew, standing in my kitchen holding a juice box with shaking hands, was that something was wrong, and that the one person acting like she wanted to help me figure out what was the same person who stood to gain control of my entire estate the moment I couldn't manage my own affairs anymore. I made an appointment with my endocrinologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, the following week, bringing 3 months of glucose logs with me. The same obsessive documentation habit that had once impressed a doctor when I was 16. Dr. Chen went quiet about halfway through reviewing my numbers. "Rachel, these crash patterns don't match your insulin regimen," she said. "Your dosing hasn't changed. Your diet hasn't changed based on what you've logged. But your lows are getting more severe and more frequent. I want to test your current insulin supply." Insulin, she explained, is a hormone, but it's also a physical liquid medication stored in vials or pens, and like any medication, it can be diluted, tampered with, or degraded, losing potency if it's exposed to heat, or literally cut with something else entirely. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer," Dr. Chen said, setting my chart down. "Does anyone else have regular access to your insulin supply? Anyone who's in your kitchen, your refrigerator on a normal basis?" I thought about lying to her. In that particular way, you lie to yourself first, before you ever get around to lying to another person. I thought about saying no, just my son, just me. "My mother," I said instead. "She's been coming over a lot since my dad passed." Dr. Chen didn't say anything judgmental. She just nodded, the way doctors do when they've heard a version of this sentence before and know exactly how heavy it is to carry. "Let's test the vial in your fridge right now," she said. "Today, not next week." 2 days later, her office called. The insulin in the vial I had brought from my refrigerator tested at roughly 60% of its expected concentration. Someone had added something to it. Most likely, given how easily it could be done with a syringe and access to my kitchen, plain water. Dr. Chen explained it to me plainly, over the phone, the way she explained everything. "Diluted insulin doesn't just fail to help," she said. "It fails quietly, in a way that looks exactly like the disease getting worse on its own, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous, and precisely why nobody tests for it unless somebody specifically asks." Nobody had ever specifically asked, until I did. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot for 11 minutes without turning the key, doing math I never wanted to do about who had a key to my house, who had been alone in my kitchen recently, and who benefited, in cold legal terms, from me becoming incapacitated. I called Diane Ortiz, our family's estate attorney, that same afternoon, not entirely sure yet what I was asking for. "I need you to explain something to me again," I told her, in plain terms. "What exactly happens to the trust if I'm declared incapacitated, medically, right now, this month?" Diane walked me through it slowly. If I were hospitalized or a doctor certified me as unable to manage my affairs, the successor trustee clause would activate almost immediately, handing temporary control of the trust, the house, my father's investment accounts, the rental property income, to my mother, pending court review that could take months, sometimes longer, to reverse. "Rachel," Diane said, her voice careful, "is there a reason you're asking me this today, specifically?" "My insulin's been tampered with," I said, "and my mother has a key to my house." The silence on the other end of the phone told me she understood exactly what I was suggesting, and exactly how serious it was. "I want you talking to a detective, not just me," Diane said. "Today, if you can." I asked her before we hung up what would actually happen to my mother if this turned out to be exactly what it looked like. "Depending on what the evidence shows," Diane said carefully, "we're not talking about a family disagreement anymore, Rachel. Deliberately tampering with someone's prescribed medication with intent to cause harm is a criminal act, full stop, regardless of who the person doing it happens to be related to. The law doesn't have a special, gentler category for mothers." I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up. Some small, stubborn part of me, even then, wanted there to be a gentler category. There wasn't. There never had been, really. I just spent 44 years pretending there was, because the alternative was too heavy to carry into every Thanksgiving. I called my pharmacy directly the next morning, a small independent place I'd used for a decade, and asked the pharmacist, a patient man named Gary, who'd filled my insulin prescription since before Tyler was born, to print out every lot number and fill date on my last 6 months of prescriptions. "Everything all right, Rachel?" he asked, sensing something in my voice. "I'm just being thorough," I said, which was true, and also the understatement of my life. I started building a case the same way I had built every spreadsheet, every tax return, every audit trail of my professional life, methodically, patiently, and without a single wasted assumption. I requested lot numbers and purchase dates from my pharmacy for every insulin vial I'd bought in the past 4 months. I cross-referenced them against my glucose logs, marking the exact dates my numbers had started behaving strangely. The pattern was almost clinical in its precision. Every unexplained crash lined up within a day or two with one of my mother's visits. I built it the way I'd build an audit trail for a client's estate. One column for the date, one for the pharmacy lot number, one for my glucose reading, one for who had been inside my house in the preceding 48 hours. When I finally printed the whole spreadsheet out and laid it across my dining table, the pattern didn't just suggest something. It screamed it. 5 crashes, 5 visits. 0 coincidences left standing. I sat with that printed spreadsheet for a long time that night, my hand flat on the pages like I could hold the information still, and I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. Cold, quiet, accountant's clarity. I didn't confront her yet, not because I was scared, though I was, but because I understood something my mother never had, that being right isn't enough. You need proof solid enough that nobody can talk their way around it, especially not someone who had spent 44 years being very, very good at talking her way around things. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you are already commenting in your head right now. Some of you have already lived a version of this. A parent, a sibling, a spouse, who smiled at you your whole life while quietly making sure you never got what you were owed. Maybe it wasn't insulin. Maybe it was money, or a will, or a story told about you at a family dinner that everyone else quietly agreed to believe. If that's you, I want you to comment one word below, just one word, for what this story feels like so far. I read every single one of them. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because the next part of this story is the part where the quiet daughter stops being quiet and starts being careful instead, which, it turns out, is so much more dangerous. While I was building my case in private, my mother was escalating hers in public, and she didn't even seem to notice the two were happening at the same time. She started coming to my house more often, sometimes unannounced, always with some small, reasonable excuse. She brought soup. Since you haven't seemed like yourself. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets. Since your father died. I just need to keep busy, Rachel. Let me have this. She started asking Tyler, my 17-year-old son, pointed little questions about my health when she thought I wasn't listening. Has your mom seemed forgetful lately? I heard her ask him once, from the hallway, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Confused? Dizzy? No, Tyler said, sounding genuinely confused by the question. She's fine, Grandma. Just checking, sweetheart, she said. Your mom's not as young as she thinks she is. I stood in that hallway with my hand against the wall and felt something in me go very still and very cold. She wasn't just hoping I'd get sick. She was building her own narrative, in real time, seeding the idea of my decline into the mind of the one witness whose testimony would matter most in any courtroom, my own son. She started staying later, too. Some nights she'd still be in my living room when I came down for water at 11, sitting in the dark with the television off, watching nothing. You don't have to keep coming over so much, Mom, I told her once, trying to sound grateful instead of unsettled. Somebody has to keep an eye on you, Rachel, she said. Especially now, with everything so uncertain. Uncertain. That was her word for it. Not my health. Not my safety. Uncertain, like weather. like something that simply happened to people instead of something being done to them. One insulin vial went missing entirely from my refrigerator door the following week. I know it was there because I logged it, the way I logged everything. 3 days later, at a dosage I hadn't touched, it was simply gone, replaced by an open vial I didn't remember opening. "You probably just misplaced it, Rachel," my mother said, when I asked her very calmly if she'd seen it. "You have been under a lot of stress." "I don't misplace insulin, Mom," I said. "I've been managing this disease since I was 12. I don't misplace it." "Well," she said, folding a dish towel with far too much care, "there's a first time for everything, isn't there?" I noticed, on my way out of the kitchen that evening, that she'd moved the chipped blue bowl, the one from my childhood counter, the one that was always just for Danny's toast, the one I'd quietly taken from my father's cupboards when we cleared out the house after he died, because some part of me still wanted it to mean something different this time. From the shelf where I kept it to the sink, upside down, like it had simply gotten in her way again. She also started bringing over paperwork. "Just in case," she said. Folders of medical power of attorney forms she'd apparently downloaded and partially filled out herself, naming her as my healthcare decision-maker, if I were ever unable to speak for myself. "You don't even have these forms yet, Rachel," she said, sliding one across my counter like it was nothing more than a grocery list. "It's just responsible planning, at our age." I didn't sign it. I photographed every page instead, front and back, and sent the images straight to Diane Ortiz, who told me flatly that presenting unsigned incapacity paperwork to a family member you are actively poisoning was, in her professional opinion, either remarkably bold or remarkably stupid, and I've learned those two things usually travel together. Around that same time, Danny called me, sounding oddly careful, to ask if I'd been under a lot of pressure lately, work-wise. I asked him where that question had come from. "Mom mentioned you'd seemed off," he said. "Forgetful. She's worried, Rachel." "I haven't spoken to Mom about work in months," I said. "She's not worried, Danny. She's rehearsing a story and she's using you to practice it on." He didn't argue with me. He also didn't fully believe me yet, and I understood, hanging up that phone, that my mother wasn't only working on my body. She was working on my witnesses. Some things you inherit without ever agreeing to. That's the moment I stopped hoping this was a misunderstanding. I called Diane Ortiz again that same night. She'd already looped in a detective from the Sacramento Police Department's Financial and Elder Vulnerability Crimes Unit, a steady, unhurried man named Detective Marcus Reyes, who specialized in cases where family caregiving and financial motive tangled together. "Ms. Bennett," Detective Reyes told me on our first call, "cases like this almost never get solved with a confession. They get solved with documentation. Keep logging everything exactly the way you have been. Don't confront her yet. Don't let her know you suspect anything specific. And call me immediately if anything changes at your house." I promised him I would. 3 weeks into his investigation, Detective Reyes called me with something I hadn't expected. He'd subpoenaed my mother's phone and email records as part of the financial exploitation angle, and found that 8 months earlier, 2 weeks before my first unexplained crash, she'd had a paid consultation with an estate attorney across town, someone with no connection to our family at all. She asked him 3 specific questions, Reyes told me. What legally counts as incapacitated for trust purposes, how fast a successor clause activates, and whether a diagnosed medical condition, quote, like a pre-existing diabetes, could make a person's incapacitation look natural instead of suspicious. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, feeling something settle into place that was almost worse than the tampering itself. "She didn't panic and improvise this, did she?" I said. It wasn't really a question. "No, ma'am," Reyes said. "She researched it first. I did not yet know that the thing that would actually break this case open wasn't going to be my spreadsheets, my lot numbers, or my glucose logs, careful as they were. It was going to be a 17-year-old boys' school project about apple pie. It was a Tuesday evening, the same Tuesday I told you about at the very beginning of this story, and Tyler was filming himself in the kitchen for a video assignment about family traditions, propping his phone against the fruit bowl on the counter so he could talk with his hands free while he practiced Grandma's apple pie recipe from memory. My mother had come over an hour earlier, ostensibly to help him with the recipe, and I had gone upstairs to take a work call, leaving the two of them in the kitchen with Tyler's phone quietly recording 6 feet away. I don't remember exactly when my blood sugar started dropping that evening. I remember coming downstairs feeling foggy, reaching for my glucose monitor, seeing a number that made my stomach drop, and then very little else clearly, except my mother's voice, oddly composed, telling someone on the phone that her daughter might have taken too much insulin. Tyler told me afterward that he'd run to get his phone to call 911 himself, only to realize his grandmother was already on with the dispatcher, and that in the chaos of paramedics arriving, he'd simply grabbed the phone off the counter and shoved it in his pocket, never even glancing at the screen, never realizing it was still recording, capturing everything happening behind him in that kitchen for almost 11 more minutes. It sat in his phone's camera roll, unwatched, for 4 days, while I recovered in the hospital from a blood sugar low so severe the ER doctor told me, gently, that another 20 minutes alone could have killed me. 4 days later, sitting by my hospital bed, Tyler finally opened the video to trim it for his class assignment, and stopped, his thumb frozen over the screen. "Mom," he said, his voice very quiet, "I need you to see something." I want to stop the story right here for 1 second, at the edge of that hospital bed, because this is the part of the story that changes everything, and I don't want to rush past it. So let me pause, just for a moment, and then I promise, we go straight into it. Tyler turned the phone toward me, and I watched, from a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, footage of my own kitchen that I had no memory of living through. In the background of Tyler's recipe video, clearly visible over his shoulder, my mother walked to the refrigerator, opened my insulin case, and drew liquid out of one vial with a syringe she had brought with her, then added it to a second vial already sitting open on the counter, diluting it, thinning it, turning medicine into something closer to water, while a boy 6 feet away recited pie crust instructions to a camera he'd forgotten was even running. She checked over her shoulder once, toward the stairs, toward where I'd gone up to take my call. Then she went back to stirring a bowl of apples like nothing in the world had happened. "She's talking about cinnamon," Tyler said, staring at his own screen like it belonged to a stranger. "She's talking about cinnamon while she's doing that." He played it again, and then a third time, his jaw tightening a little more each time, the way mine used to tighten at 14 over a spiral notebook nobody wanted to look at. "Mom, I filmed Grandma the whole time and I didn't even see her," he said. "I was standing right there." "You weren't supposed to see her, sweetheart," I said. That was the whole point. I asked him gently to send me the raw file before he touched it for his school project, before he trimmed a single second. Some instinct, old and practiced, told me not to let anyone edit that footage until people whose job it was to look at evidence had seen it exactly as it was recorded. He didn't argue. He just looked at me, 17 years old, holding a phone that had apparently just saved his mother's life without either of them knowing it at the time, and said the only thing that made sense to say, "I'm glad I forgot to turn it off." I made him send that video to Diane Ortiz and Detective Reyes within the hour, straight from the hospital, my hands shaking again, though this time from something other than low blood sugar. Detective Reyes called me back within 20 minutes. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "combined with your glucose logs, the pharmacy lot numbers, and now this footage, we have more than enough to move. I need you to help me set up one more conversation with your mother, somewhere she feels comfortable, somewhere she won't expect what's coming." I thought about it for exactly one night, lying in that hospital bed, running the numbers the way I'd run every important number in my life, carefully, patiently, checking my work twice before committing to the answer. I thought about the version of me who used to go back to sleep alone after a nightmare because nobody was coming down that hall. I thought about the version of me who logged every low blood sugar in a spiral notebook nobody wanted to look at. Both of those versions of me had spent their whole lives building, without knowing it, toward this exact decision. Then I told him yes. Diane Ortiz met me at the hospital the next morning with a folder an inch thick, my glucose logs going back 4 months, the pharmacy's written confirmation of the diluted vial, and a formal notarized statement from Dr. Chen, describing the tampering in plain clinical language a jury could follow without a medical degree. She laid it all across the little rolling hospital table like she was building a case file out of my own kitchen. "This is enough on its own," Diane told me. "The video isn't the whole case, Rachel. It's the proof nobody can argue with. Everything else in this folder is why a jury believes what they're about to see." Detective Reyes wanted the confrontation somewhere with witnesses who couldn't be dismissed as biased. Not just me, not just Tyler, but Danny too, present, in the room, unable to claim later he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. "One more thing, Ms. Bennett," he told me, before we hung up that call. 22 years on this job. I have seen exactly 2 cases where the victim built the file herself, start to finish, before we ever got involved. You're about to be the 3rd. I want you to know that going in, whatever happens today, you already did the hard part. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said thank you, which felt small for what he'd actually just told me, but it was what I had. I sat Tyler down the night before, at our kitchen table, and told him plainly what was going to happen, because he deserved that much after everything his phone had already carried for our family. "You don't have to be there if you don't want to be," I told him. "Nobody would blame you. She almost killed you in front of me and didn't even know I was filming it," he said. "I want to be there." He was 17 years old, and in that moment he sounded more like a grown man than half the adults I'd grown up around. "We chose my father's memorial dinner, 3 weeks later, at my house, the first time our whole family would be together since the funeral. My mother, my brother Danny, Tyler, and me, sitting around the same table where my mother had spent 40 years making sure I understood exactly how much less I mattered than my brother. Detective Reyes and 1 plainclothes officer waited in an unmarked car down the street. Diane Ortiz sat at the table with us, introduced simply as helping settle some estate paperwork, which was technically true. Dinner went exactly the way dinners in that house always had. My mother fussing over Danny's new promotion, barely glancing my way, until I set my laptop on the table after the plates were cleared, and said, quietly, that there was something everyone needed to see before we moved forward with the trust paperwork. "Rachel, is this really necessary at your father's memorial dinner?" my mother said, already reaching for her wine glass, already performing the wounded tone she'd perfected over 4 decades. "Yes," I said. "It is." I played 11 seconds of the video. Just 11. My mother, at my refrigerator, syringe in hand, checking over her shoulder toward the stairs. The table went so silent I could hear the refrigerator humming behind her, the same refrigerator in the footage. "That's not what it looks like," my mother said, too fast, her voice climbing half an octave. I was checking the expiration dates, Rachel. You know how forgetful you've been." "You told a 911 dispatcher I'd taken too much insulin," I said, my voice as calm and even as every number I had ever logged in 32 years. "You've been telling my own son I'm getting confused and forgetful. And my endocrinologist tested that vial, Mom. It was 60% water." "You were always so dramatic, Rachel," she said, her voice sharpening into something I recognized from 30 years of birthdays that weren't mine. "Even as a little girl, everything had to be about you. I have spent my entire life making sure nothing was about me," I said. "That was never the problem, Mom. That was always yours. I want that video deleted right now, Rachel," she said, her hand actually reaching toward my laptop before she caught herself. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of." "I know exactly what I'm accusing you of," I said. "I have 4 months of glucose logs, pharmacy lot numbers, a lab test on that vial, and now 11 seconds of footage. I'm not accusing you of anything, Mom. I'm telling you what happened." "I don't know what you're implying," she said, standing now, her chair scraping back hard enough to catch Danny's arm. "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm done implying things. I spent my whole childhood being the strong one so nobody would have to worry about me. I am done being strong quietly." That's when Detective Reyes knocked on my front door. My mother's face, when 2 officers stepped into that dining room, did something I had never once seen it do in 44 years of watching it perform calm for every audience but me. It cracked. She looked for just a moment at the empty chair where my father used to sit at the head of that table, and something in her expression almost looked like shame. Almost. Then it was gone, replaced by the same old reflex she'd been running for 4 decades. "Danny, tell them," she said, spinning toward my brother, grabbing for the one ally she'd spent his entire life buying. "Tell them your sister is being dramatic. Tell them—" Danny didn't say anything for a long moment. He was looking at his own mother with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn it myself for 4 decades. The look of someone finally doing math they'd refused to do for years. "Mom," he said quietly. "I watched the video on the way over. Diane sent it to me too." Carol Bennett was arrested in my dining room, in front of my father's photograph on the mantel, 20 minutes after Detective Reyes read her the specific charges building against her. Attempted poisoning, elder on adult tampering with a controlled medication, and financial exploitation tied to the trust's incapacity clause, since prosecutors would later argue every crash had been engineered to trigger that exact legal contingency. I did not cry when they walked her out of my house. I remember that clearly, because for so many years, I had assumed that moment, if it ever came, would break something loose in me. It didn't. It closed something instead. In the weeks that followed, the case moved the way these cases move, slowly, then suddenly, then slowly again. The district attorney's office formally entered Detective Reyes's phone records into evidence, confirming on paper now what he'd told me on that call from my hospital bed. This had never been improvised. A forensic analyst confirmed Tyler's video file's original metadata, the timestamp, the device signature, all of it unedited and unaltered from the moment it was recorded, which meant the defense never even bothered trying to argue the footage had been staged or doctored, because there was simply no version of that argument that survived contact with the data. My mother's own attorney told Diane, off the record, that the metadata alone had ended any real chance of a trial. Carol Bennett pleaded no contest eventually, rather than face trial, to reduce charges of attempted poisoning and financial elder exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a legal category that, in a small, bitter irony, existed to protect people like her from people like me, until a prosecutor pointed out it could just as easily protect me from her. She received probation, mandatory psychiatric evaluation, and a permanent restraining order barring her from my home, and from any role, ever again, in my father's trust. Detective Reyes closed the case with a note in the file that Diane later read to me, almost as a courtesy, since I'd technically built most of it myself. Case built by victim's own documentation. Rarely see paperwork this clean. I've been called a lot of things by my family over the years. Clean paperwork might be my favorite one yet. Dr. Chen adjusted my insulin regimen once the tampering stopped, and within 3 weeks my numbers went back to looking like they had for 32 years before any of this happened. Boring, stable, mine. I started seeing a therapist twice a month after everything settled, mostly at Tyler's gentle insistence, and mostly for the version of grief nobody sends casseroles for. Grieving a mother who is still alive, still breathing, still somewhere in the world, but who I finally understood I was never going to get to have. My therapist calls it grieving the parent you wished for instead of the one you got. Some weeks I just call it exhausting. But it's a clean kind of exhausting. The kind with no more secrets buried inside it. Which is new for me. Danny didn't fully cut her off. I understood that, even if it still ached somewhere old and familiar in me. But he stopped defending her, and he started showing up, actually showing up, at Tyler's games, at my hospital follow-ups, in ways he never had growing up either. "I spent our whole childhood watching her hand me things she took from you," he told me once, sitting in my kitchen, the same refrigerator humming in the background. I didn't want to see it back then. I see it now. Mark, my ex-husband, drove over the night everything happened at the memorial dinner. Not because I asked him to, but because Tyler called him, shaking, and Mark simply showed up and made pancakes for our son at 11 at night, because it was the only thing he could think to do with his hands. He and I aren't back together, and we were never going to be. But I won't forget that he came without being asked. Diane Ortiz finalized the trust exactly as my father had written it, with me as sole trustee, no successor clause activated, no court battle required, because the only person who ever tried to trigger it was the one now barred from benefiting by it. She sent me a card afterward that just said, "Your father knew exactly who to trust." so did you eventually with yourself. I keep it in my desk drawer. Tyler, for what it's worth, finished his school video about family traditions. He cut the footage of his grandmother entirely, obviously, and instead filmed a new segment, alone, in that same kitchen, talking about the recipe his mother had taught him instead. The one where you check the numbers twice before you trust them, he said, only half joking, and I understood exactly which numbers he meant. I go back to that kitchen every day now, the same counter, the same refrigerator door, the same spot on the floor where I once lay shaking while a woman who gave birth to me lied calmly to a stranger on the phone. It doesn't scare me the way I thought it might. If anything, it reminds me of something simpler, that the version of me who learned to log every low blood sugar at 12 years old, alone, unhelped, was quietly building the exact tool that would someday save her own life. The chipped blue bowl sits on my counter now, right side up, and some mornings I mix Tyler's cinnamon toast in it myself, just because I can, just because nobody gets to tell me anymore whose bowl it was always supposed to be. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's this one. The people who count on you staying quiet are usually counting on you staying unprepared too. They mistake calm for weak and patience for permission. Keep your own records, trust your own numbers, and know that the quietest person at the table is very often the one holding the only proof that matters. I used to think being underestimated was just something that happened to me. Now I understand it was the one advantage nobody ever managed to take away, no matter how hard they tried. Because the moment somebody stops watching you closely is exactly the moment you get to build, quietly, whatever it is you're going to need later. If this story reminded you of your own mother, your own sibling, your own quiet years of being the strong one so nobody else had to be, I want you to know you're not imagining it, and you're not alone in this comment section tonight. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from, and if this one hit close to home, give it a like. Share it with someone who'd understand it, and subscribe to Betrayal House for the next story of someone who stayed calm long enough to win.